The delegation ships descended through Earth's atmosphere with practiced grace, and Ambassador Velix of the Korthon Empire watched the blue planet grow larger in the viewport with satisfaction. This was his 47th first contact mission, and they all followed the same pattern. The new species would be overwhelmed by the majesty of the Galactic Council's arrival, and within weeks, they would be negotiating terms of membership and trade agreements. Velix had brought his finest ceremonial robes for the occasion, and his staff had prepared the standard welcome package containing the Council Charter in Earth's dominant languages. The human government had designated a meeting location in a city called Geneva, and Velix found the choice appropriate since his research indicated it had historical significance for human diplomacy. When his shuttle landed at the specified coordinates, he was greeted by a delegation of humans in formal attire, but something felt different from the start. The humans were polite and professional, but there was no awe in their eyes and no excitement in their voices. They treated the arrival of an interstellar civilization the way one might greet a business associate, cordial but measured. Admiral Richard Blake stepped forward as the primary human representative, and he was a tall man in his late 50s, with gray hair and steady blue eyes. He shook Velix's hand with a firm grip and welcomed the delegation to Earth, without any of the usual stammering or nervousness that Velix had come to expect from newly contacted species. The formal reception proceeded smoothly with both sides, exchanging pleasantries, and the humans provided a tour of their United Nations, building and explained their own history of attempting to create peaceful international cooperation. Velix launched into his prepared speech about the benefits of Council membership and the opportunities that awaited humanity among the stars. He spoke of trade networks, spanning thousands of worlds, and the collective security that came from joining the galaxy's premier alliance. He explained how the Council had maintained peace for over 2,000 years, through careful negotiation and mutual obligation. Every species that joined surrendered certain aspects of sovereignty in exchange for protection and prosperity. It was a small price to pay for admission to galactic civilization. Admiral Blake listened attentively and took notes and asked several clarifying questions about trade tariffs and military obligations and the Council's decision-making process. Velix answered each question thoroughly and felt confident that the humans were simply being careful and methodical in their evaluation. Some species took longer than others to appreciate the magnitude of what was being offered. He had time, and the Council was patient with promising new members. The formal meetings continued for 3 days, and the humans requested copies of all Council documents, including the complete charter and the trade regulations and the mutual defense treaties. Velix provided everything gladly, and his staff worked around the clock to translate the millions of words into human languages. On the 4th day, Admiral Blake requested a final meeting, and Velix arrived, expecting to begin preliminary membership negotiations. Instead, Blake delivered a message that left Velix speechless. Humanity had carefully reviewed all the materials provided and had consulted with their governments and their legal experts and their military advisors. After thorough consideration, Earth's united leadership had decided to respectfully decline membership in the Galactic Council. They appreciated the offer and recognized the achievements of the Council, but humanity preferred to chart its own course among the stars. They wished the Council continued success and hoped that friendly relations could be maintained. Even without formal membership, Velix felt his breathing apparatus constrict, and he struggled to process what he was hearing. In 2,000 years of Council expansion, no species had ever refused membership. Some had negotiated harder than others, and some had requested modifications to specific terms, but none had simply said no. He asked Blake to repeat the decision, thinking perhaps the translation had malfunctioned, but the Admiral's words were clear and unmistakable. Velix immediately requested a private communication with the Council leadership and spent 2 hours explaining the situation. The response from Nexus Prime was confusion, followed by disbelief, followed by demands for clarification. Council President Thorum personally joined the communication channel and instructed Velix to determine what the humans really wanted. Surely this was a negotiating tactic, and humanity was simply trying to gain leverage for better membership terms. Velix was ordered to return to the negotiations and find out what price would satisfy the humans. But when Velix met with Blake again, the Admiral was polite but firm. There was no hidden agenda and no negotiating tactic. Humanity had examined the Council system and found it incompatible with their values. The trade restrictions were too limiting, and the military obligations too binding, and the surrender of sovereignty too complete. Humans had spent their entire history fighting for the right of self-determination, and they were not willing to hand that over to a foreign government. Regardless of how large or successful it might be, Blake explained that humanity had only recently achieved faster-than-light travel, and they wanted the freedom to explore and expand at their own pace. They wanted to make their own trade agreements with other species and maintain full control over their military forces and keep their political independence intact. The Council system required new members to accept standardized trade rates and contribute ships to the collective defense fleet and submit major policy decisions to Council approval. These requirements were unacceptable to Earth's governments. Velix tried every argument in his considerable diplomatic arsenal. He warned of the dangers of isolation and the predatory species that roamed unclaimed space. He explained that independent species rarely survive long without Council protection. He described the economic advantages of joining the largest trade network in the galaxy and the technological exchanges that had lifted countless civilizations to new heights. Blake listened to everything and thanked Velix for his concerns, but the answer remained no. The delegation departed Earth 3 days later, and Velix filed the most unusual report of his career. The return journey to Nexus Prime took 2 weeks, and during that time the Council leadership struggled to formulate a response. Emergency sessions were called, and legal experts pored over ancient precedents, and diplomatic scholars debated theoretical scenarios. By the time Velix's ship docked at the massive Council station, the entire organization was in turmoil. The Central Assembly convened in full session for the first time in decades, and representatives from all member species gathered to discuss the human situation. Some argued that humanity should be left alone to learn from their mistakes. Others insisted that humans posed a dangerous precedent that could encourage other species to question their membership. A few radical voices even suggested that force might be necessary to bring humanity into compliance with galactic norms. But underneath all the debate was a growing sense of panic, because the Council's entire structure was built on the assumption that every species would eventually join. The economic models and the defense strategies and the political frameworks all assumed universal participation. Humanity's refusal was not just an inconvenience, but it threatened the philosophical foundation of everything the Council had built. If one species could say no and survive, then others might follow, and the careful order that had been maintained for 2 millennia could begin to unravel. Admiral Blake returned to his office in Geneva and began preparing humanity's next moves, because Earth's decision to decline Council membership was only the beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the human delegation had politely shown ambassador Velix to his ship, and the Galactic Council was still scrambling to understand what had happened. Intelligence reports began flooding into Nexus Prime, and none of them brought comfort to the worried Council members. Human vessels had been spotted in dozens of star systems, and colony ships were heading toward unclaimed worlds at an alarming rate. Humanity was expanding, and they were doing it fast. Council Economic Minister Zaret H. sat in her office reviewing the latest data with growing concern. She was a methodical being from a species that valued precision and order above all else, and the numbers she was seeing made no sense according to traditional patterns. New species typically spent decades building their first handful of colonies, and they relied heavily on Council support and resources during this vulnerable period. Humans had established 17 colonies in less than a month and showed no signs of slowing down. What troubled Zeroth even more were the reports of human contact with other species. Humanity was not hiding in their corner of space, as the Council had expected. Instead, they were actively seeking out their neighbors and opening communications and offering trade agreements. These were not the actions of an isolated species afraid of the galaxy, but rather the moves of a confident civilization ready to engage on their own terms. She pulled up a specific file that had arrived that morning and read it 3 times. to make sure she understood correctly. The humans had made contact with the Velzen Collective and were offering a trade. It's a partnership that included technology exchanges and mutual defense agreements and completely free trade, with no tariffs or restrictions. The proposed terms were shockingly generous compared to what the Council typically offered, and the Velzen were seriously considering accepting. Zareth immediately requested a meeting with the Council President and brought her findings to his attention. President Thorum listened with increasing agitation as she explained that the human trade model could destabilize the entire Council economy. The Council's financial system was built on controlled trade routes and standardized tariffs that ensured resources flowed properly between member worlds. If humans started offering better deals to frontier species, then those species might choose human partnerships over Council membership. The President called an emergency economic session, and representatives from the major trading guilds arrived at Nexus Prime within days. The mood in the chamber was tense, and several guild masters openly accused the Council of losing control of the situation. One particularly vocal representative demanded to know why the Council had not forced humanity into compliance, and another suggested that economic sanctions should be imposed immediately. But sanctions required targets, and humanity was trading in unclaimed space with non-member species, so there was nothing to sanction yet. The Council's laws only applied to member worlds and humanity. It made sure to keep all their activities outside Council jurisdiction. It was frustrating and clever and completely legal according to the Council's own charter. Meanwhile, Captain Helen Morris was docking her ship, the Pathfinder, at a Velzen orbital station and preparing for her third round of negotiations with their leadership council. She was a career diplomat who had spent 20 years working in Earth's foreign service before volunteering for humanity's new interstellar diplomatic corps. The Velzen had been petitioning for Galactic Council membership for 40 years and kept getting rejected because their worlds were poor in strategic resources, and the Council saw little benefit in adding them. Helen had reviewed the Velzen's application files and saw a species that was peaceful and industrious and eager to join the wider galaxy. They had been waiting patiently for the Council to accept them while watching wealthier species get fast-tracked to membership. The Velzen leadership was cautious but clearly interested in what humanity had to offer. The meeting took place in a simple conference room, and Helen laid out her proposal with straightforward honesty. Humanity would share advanced manufacturing technology in exchange for the Velzen's expertise in sustainable agriculture. Both species would commit to mutual defense, meaning an attack on one would be treated as an attack on both. Trade between their worlds would be completely free, with no government fees or restrictions. There would be no bureaucracy and no waiting periods and no requirements to surrender sovereignty. The Velzen Council members looked at each other, and their leader asked the obvious question: what did humanity want in return beyond the agricultural knowledge? Helen smiled and explained that humans believed in building genuine partnerships where both sides benefited equally. Earth had plenty of resources and technology, but they needed friends and allies as they expanded into a galaxy full of unknowns. The Velzen would be partners, not subordinates. The Velzen agreed to the partnership within the hour, and Helen transmitted the news back to Earth with quiet satisfaction. This was the fourth species to accept a human alliance proposal, and she knew there would be many more. The galaxy was full of civilizations that had been waiting at the Council's door for decades, and humanity was offering them an alternative, back on Nexus Prime. The Council received word of the human-Velzen partnership, and another emergency session was called. This time the debate was more heated, and several members openly advocated for military intervention. A delegate from the Krillian Dominion argued that humanity was deliberately undermining Council authority and should be treated as a hostile power. If humans wanted to operate in galactic space, then they needed to follow galactic rules. A counter-argument came from Ambassador Felix, who had been studying human history and culture extensively. Since his failed mission to Earth, he explained that humans had a long tradition of resisting what they perceived as unjust authority, and that pushing them too hard would only make the situation worse. The Council needed to find a diplomatic solution that acknowledged human sovereignty while protecting Council interests. That the debate went on for hours and no consensus could be reached. Finally, President Thorum called for a vote on whether to establish a military blockade around human space. The measure failed by a narrow margin, but the fact that it had even been proposed showed how desperate the Council was becoming. Admiral Gregory Walsh was monitoring these Council proceedings through back channels that humanity had established among sympathetic species. When he learned about the proposed blockade, he immediately drafted a response and sent it through official diplomatic channels. The message was brief and professional, but the implications were clear. Humanity remained committed to peaceful coexistence with all species, including Council members, but any attempt to restrict human movement in neutral space would be considered an act of aggression and would be met with appropriate defensive measures. The message arrived at Nexus Prime during another Council session and was read aloud to the full assembly. Several members dismissed it as an empty threat from a species barely capable of interstellar travel, but others were not so sure. Human technology had proven surprisingly advanced, and their expansion rates suggested significant industrial capability. A military confrontation might not be as one-sided as the Council assumed. Zareth returned to her office that evening and pulled up the economic projections again. If current trends continued, then, within 6 months, at least a dozen frontier species would have established partnerships with humanity. Within a year, the Council's economic monopoly on the outer sectors would be broken. Within 5 years, the entire structure of galactic trade could be fundamentally altered. She prepared a detailed report outlining these projections and included a recommendation that shocked even herself. The Council needed to negotiate with humanity as equals rather than as subjects seeking admission. It was a radical suggestion that went against 2,000 years of precedent, but Zareth could see no other path forward that did not end in either war or economic collapse. The report was submitted to President Thorum and several other senior Council members, and it sparked yet another round of heated debates. The hardliners insisted that capitulating to human demands would encourage other species to challenge Council authority, but the moderates argued that the alternative was worse. The Council was facing a crisis of legitimacy in how they handled humanity would determine their future on Earth. Admiral Blake was coordinating with Captain Morris and the other human diplomatic teams spread across the frontier sectors. The strategy was working better than anyone had hoped, and more species were reaching out to humanity every day, asking about partnership opportunities. Blake knew that the Council would eventually respond with either acceptance or force, but humanity was preparing for both possibilities. The stars continued their ancient dance, and two civilizations moved toward an inevitable confrontation that would reshape the galaxy. The Council chambers had been filled with angry voices and desperate proposals for weeks, but President Thorum finally managed to quiet the assembly long enough to propose a different approach. He suggested sending their most skilled diplomat to meet with humanity and truly understand what motivated their refusal. If the Council could comprehend human reasoning, then perhaps they could find a solution that satisfied both sides. The assembly agreed reluctantly, and the task fell to Kren of the assemblage. Kren was not a typical diplomat, and that was exactly why Thorum had chosen him. He was a philosophical scholar who had spent 3 centuries studying the belief systems of different species and finding common ground between seemingly incompatible worldviews. If anyone could bridge the gap between human thinking and Council philosophy, it would be Kren. He accepted the assignment with his characteristic calm and began preparing for what he suspected would be the most challenging negotiation of his long career. The meeting was arranged at a neutral space, stationed in unclaimed territory, and both sides agreed to minimal security presence. Kren arrived with only 2 assistants and found the humans had sent an equally small delegation. Dr. Lisa Morgan was waiting for him in the station's diplomatic suite, and she greeted Kren with genuine warmth that surprised him. She was a woman in her early 40s with dark hair and intelligent eyes, and her credentials showed expertise in political philosophy and Interstellar law. They began with the customary exchange of pleasantries, and Kren found Lisa to be articulate and well-informed. About council history, she asked thoughtful questions about his previous diplomatic work and seemed genuinely interested in his philosophical studies. It was clear that humanity had sent someone who could engage on an intellectual level rather than just repeat political positions. Kren appreciated this and felt cautiously optimistic about the discussions ahead. When they finally turned to the central question, Kren laid out the council's perspective with careful precision. He explained that the galaxy had been a dangerous place before the council's formation, with countless wars between species competing for resources and territory. The council had been created to prevent such conflicts through binding agreements and shared sacrifice. Every member species surrendered certain aspects of sovereignty, but in return they gained security and prosperity and a voice in galactic affairs. It was a system built on collective decision-making, where the needs of the many outweighed the desires of the few. Lisa listened without interrupting and took notes, and when Kren finished, she sat quietly for a moment before responding. She acknowledged that the council had achieved remarkable things and that its track record of maintaining peace was impressive. But she asked Kren to consider what that peace had cost. How many species had joined the council, not because they wanted to, but because they had no other choice? How many civilizations had been economically pressured or diplomatically isolated until membership seemed like the only viable option? Kren started to object, but Lisa raised her hand gently and continued. She explained that humans had spent thousands of years fighting wars over the right to govern themselves. They had overthrown kings and emperors and colonial powers because they believed that people should be free to choose their own path. Human history was filled with mistakes and conflicts and terrible suffering, but through all of it ran a common thread, which was the conviction that freedom mattered more than safety. She pulled up a display showing quotes from human philosophers and political leaders throughout history, and Kren read them with growing fascination. The words spoke of liberty and self-determination and the inherent dignity of choosing one's own fate, even if that choice led to hardship. Lisa explained that when humans looked at the council system, they did not see protection, but control. The requirements to accept standardized trade rates and contribute military forces and submit policy decisions for approval looked less like membership in an alliance and more like submission to a central authority. Kren challenged this interpretation and argued that the council's structure ensured fairness and prevented any single species from dominating others, but Lisa countered that true fairness could not be imposed from above. Real cooperation had to be voluntary, and genuine partnerships required both sides to maintain their independence. The council system assumed that centralized control was necessary for peace, but human experience suggested otherwise. Earth had multiple governments and competing interests and frequent disagreements, but they had learned to coexist without surrendering their sovereignty to a global authority. Discussion continued for hours, and Kren found himself intellectually engaged in a way he had not experienced in decades. Lisa was not simply being stubborn or irrational, and her arguments were philosophically sound. She understood the council's reasoning, but genuinely believed there was a better way. Humans wanted to cooperate with other species and participate in galactic civilization, but they wanted to do so as equals rather than as members of a hierarchical system. Kren asked what would happen if every species adopted the human model and refused to accept any central authority. Would that not lead to chaos and conflict? Lisa acknowledged the risk, but suggested that the fear of chaos was often used to justify excessive control. Humans believed that sovereign species could work together through mutual respect and shared interests without needing a supreme governing body. It required more effort and more trust, but it also preserved the freedom that made civilizations unique. The conversation shifted to practical matters, and Kren asked how humans intended to handle disputes with other species without council mediation. Lisa explained that humanity was prepared to negotiate directly with their neighbors and establish bilateral agreements, and accept arbitration from neutral parties when conflicts arose. It was more complicated than the Council's one-size-fits-all approach, but humans believed it was worth the extra complexity. To maintain their independence, Kren spent 3 days talking with Lisa and touring human facilities and meeting with other members of the human diplomatic corps. He came away troubled because he could not dismiss their arguments as naive or illogical. The humans had carefully considered the implications of their choice, and they were willing to accept the challenges that came with independence. More importantly, their philosophy was internally consistent and based on genuine principles rather than mere self-interest. When Kren returned to Nexus Prime, he delivered a report that sent shockwaves through the Council. He explained that humanity's refusal was not a negotiating tactic or a temporary position, but a fundamental philosophical difference. Humans believed in voluntary cooperation between sovereign equals, while the Council believed in binding agreements with centralized authority. These two worldviews were not compatible, and no amount of negotiation would bridge that gap. The report included a warning that Kren knew would be unwelcome. Human arguments were philosophically sound, and some of the younger Council species were already beginning to ask dangerous questions. If the Council tried to force humanity into compliance, it would only validate human concerns about the Council being a controlling rather than cooperative organization. But if the Council accepted humanity's independence, it would set a precedent that could unravel the entire system. President Thorum read the report 3 times and felt a growing sense of dread. The situation was worse than he had feared, because Kren was not simply reporting that humans were being difficult, but rather that they had exposed a fundamental flaw in the Council's philosophy. For 2,000 years, the Council had operated on the assumption that their system was the only rational way to organize galactic civilization. And now, humans were demonstrating that rational beings could disagree. Within days of Kren's report, several minor species formally requested to review their membership terms. They cited concerns about trade restrictions and military obligations, and the lack of real autonomy in Council decision-making. These species had been members for decades, or even centuries, but the human example had inspired them to question whether their membership was truly voluntary or simply the only option they had been. Given the Council leadership met in emergency session, and the mood was grim. Some members accused Kren of being seduced by human philosophy and demanded his removal from the diplomatic corps. Others recognized that shooting the messenger would not change the underlying reality. The Council was facing an ideological crisis, and how they responded would determine whether their 2,000-year legacy would endure or collapse. Admiral Blake received regular updates on the Council's internal debates, and he understood that the situation was reaching a critical point. Humanity had not wanted to destabilize galactic civilization, but they had been unwilling to surrender their freedom for the sake of convenience. Now the Council had to decide whether they valued their control more than the principles they claimed to uphold. The next move would reveal the true nature of the Galactic Council, and Blake was preparing for all possible outcomes. The moderate voices in the Council were losing ground in war. Coordinator Thex of the Krillian Dominion had spent weeks building support for a more aggressive approach. He was a military strategist who believed that the Council's hesitation was being interpreted as weakness, and that humanity's influence needed to be contained before it spread further. In a heated assembly session, he argued that every day of inaction encouraged more species to question their membership, and that the Council's authority was bleeding away while they debated philosophy. Dex proposed establishing what he called a defensive perimeter around human space, and the terminology was carefully chosen to sound reasonable. Ships entering or leaving human territory would be stopped and searched to ensure they were not carrying restricted technology or materials. It was framed as a security measure rather than an act of aggression, but everyone in the chamber understood what it really meant. The Council was going to blockade humanity and force them to either negotiate or face isolation. President Thorum opposed the measure and warned that it would be seen as an act of war, but he no longer had the votes to stop it. The hardliners had convinced enough moderate members that something had to be done, and the defensive perimeter was authorized by a narrow majority. They immediately began deploying Council warships to strategic positions around human space, and within a week, the blockade was in place. The first test came quickly, and Commander Jake Peterson was leading a supply convoy of 5 human cargo ships heading toward the Velzen system with agricultural equipment and manufacturing components. His ships were traveling through neutral space along established trade routes and carrying legal goods under standard shipping manifests. When his sensors detected a formation of Krillian warships moving to intercept, he knew the situation had just become serious. The Krillian commander ordered Peterson to heave to for inspection, and Peterson responded that his ships were in neutral space and operating under no council jurisdiction. He requested clarification on what legal authority the council claimed for stopping vessels outside their territory. The Krillian commander repeated the order and added that failure to comply would be treated as hostile action. Peterson opened a channel to all ships in the convoy and ran through the protocols they had trained for. Humanity had anticipated this scenario, and his orders were clear. Do not fire first, but do not submit to illegal searches. He transmitted a final message to the Krillian ships, stating that his convoy would continue on its authorized route, and any attempt to forcibly board his vessels would be considered an act of piracy. The Krillian warships moved to intercept, and Peterson waited until they were within weapons range before giving his next order. The human ships had been outfitted with defensive systems that the Council had never encountered, and when the Krillians attempted to disable the convoy's engines with targeted fire, the human point defense systems intercepted every shot. The Krillian commander was stunned and immediately escalated to full weapons release. What followed was a brief but devastating engagement that shocked everyone monitoring the encounter. The human ships moved with precision that seemed impossible for civilian cargo vessels, and their countermeasures defeated every attempt to lock targeting systems. When Peterson finally authorized return fire, his ships struck with surgical accuracy that disabled Krillian weapons and engines while leaving crew quarters and life support completely intact. Within minutes, 5 Krillian warships were floating dead in space with crews unharmed, but ships unable to maneuver or fight. Peterson transmitted rescue coordinates to the nearest Council station and continued his convoy to the Velzen system. He delivered his cargo on schedule and filed a formal protest with the Council about the unprovoked attack on human vessels in neutral space. The entire engagement had been recorded, and the footage spread across the galaxy within hours. The Council chamber erupted into chaos. When the battle reports arrived and Nex found himself defending his strategy against angry accusations. Some members demanded to know how civilian human cargo ships had defeated military warships, and others wanted to know why they had not been informed that humanity possessed such advanced defensive technology. President Thorum pointed out that the blockade had failed in its first real test and had only succeeded in proving that humans could defend themselves. But the damage to the Council's reputation went far beyond the military defeat, and species across the galaxy had watched human ships operating with restraint and precision. Despite being attacked first, the humans had deliberately avoided casualties and had only disabled rather than destroyed their opponents. It was a demonstration of both capability and discipline that impressed many observers and worried Council leadership. 3. Species formally announced their withdrawal from Council membership applications within days of the incident, and they cited concerns about the Council's willingness to use military force against peaceful trade convoys. 2 current member species privately approached human diplomats through back channels asking about the possibility of joining humanity's growing network of partnerships. The situation that Vex had tried to contain was now spiraling out of control. Admiral Blake convened an emergency meeting with his senior staff and they analyzed the implications of the engagement. The humans had won a tactical victory, but Blake knew that the Council could not afford to let this stand without response. The hardliners would demand escalation, and the moderate voices that had been trying to find a diplomatic solution would be drowned out by calls for military action. Humanity needed to prepare for the possibility of a full-scale conflict, intelligence reports confirmed Blake's fears, and the Council was mobilizing its entire defensive fleet. Over 10,000 warships were being assembled at staging points throughout Council space, and the logistics alone suggested they were preparing for major operations. War Coordinator Thex had convinced the Council leadership that humanity represented an existential threat and that overwhelming force was necessary to end the crisis. President Thorum made one final attempt to halt the escalation and proposed sending another diplomatic delegation to Earth, but Dex blocked the measure. He argued that humanity had already demonstrated their unwillingness to negotiate in good faith, and that further talk would only give them time to prepare defenses. The Council had tried diplomacy and economic pressure and limited military action. None of it had worked, and now they needed to show the galaxy that defying the Council had consequences. Blake received intelligence about the fleet mobilization and immediately began coordinating with the 17 species that had joined humanity's free trade coalition. Most of them had limited military capabilities, but several had pledged to honor their mutual defense agreements. More importantly, the coalition included 2 species that were still technically Council members, but had quietly signed defense pacts with humanity. If the Council attacked, they would not be fighting just humans. Captain Helen Morris was recalled from her diplomatic mission to help prepare the coalition's response, and she arrived at Earth's orbital command station with a sense of dread. She had spent months building relationships and establishing trust with species that genuinely wanted peaceful cooperation. Now all of that work might be destroyed by a war that neither side truly wanted, but both seemed unable to avoid. The human military began running combat simulations, and the results were sobering. Humanity had superior technology in many areas, and their tactical doctrine emphasized precision and adaptability, but they were vastly outnumbered. The Council fleet represented the combined military might of hundreds of worlds, and even with coalition support, the humans would be facing impossible odds in a direct confrontation. Blake studied the simulations and understood that conventional military thinking would not save humanity in this situation. If the Council wanted a war of attrition, they would win through sheer numbers. Humanity needed a different approach, and Blake started developing a strategy that would force the Council to reconsider their assumptions about power and control. Meanwhile, on Nexus Prime, the Council fleet continued to gather, and Dex briefed his commanders on the battle plan. They would establish a complete quarantine around human space and prevent any ships from entering or leaving. If humanity attempted to break the quarantine, the fleet would engage with overwhelming force. The goal was not to destroy humanity, but to force them to accept Council authority. Dex believed that once humans understood they could not win, they would finally agree to negotiate. Ambassador Velix watched the preparations with a heavy heart, and he had spent enough time studying human culture to know that Dex was making a fundamental miscalculation. Humans did not respond to threats the way the Council expected, and throughout their history, they had repeatedly chosen to fight impossible odds rather than surrender their freedom. This was not going to end the way Dex imagined. The galaxy held its breath as the Council fleet moved into position and humanity prepared its defenses. Communication channels between Earth and Nexus Prime had gone silent, and both sides were committed to their chosen paths. The stars themselves seemed to wait as too. Civilizations moved toward a confrontation that would reshape the understanding of power and cooperation throughout. The galaxy and the outcome would determine not just humanity's fate, but the future of the Council itself. The Council fleet had been in position for 2 days when Admiral Blake transmitted a request for a final audience. With the full Council assembly and the message surprised everyone because most had expected humanity to either surrender or launch a desperate preemptive strike. President Thorum consulted with his advisors, and several argued it was a trap, but Ambassador Felix suggested they had nothing to lose by listening. The council agreed to receive Blake at Nexus Prime. Under strict security protocols, Blake arrived alone except for 2 aides, and he carried himself with the calm confidence of someone who held better cards than his opponents suspected. The council chamber was filled to capacity with representatives from every member species and all of them expected to witness humanity's capitulation. War Coordinator Dex sat near the front with barely concealed satisfaction, and he had spent weeks preparing for this moment. President Thorum opened the session and offered Blake the opportunity to address the assembly. Blake thanked him and activated a holographic display that filled the center of the chamber. What appeared was not a plea for mercy, but a comprehensive presentation that would shake the council to its foundation. Blake began by showing historical records that human intelligence had compiled over the past months. The data showed how council membership negotiations had actually worked throughout their 2,000-year history. Species that initially refused membership faced coordinated economic warfare where their trade routes were mysteriously disrupted and their markets suddenly closed. Border incidents would occur with convenient timing where council forces happened to be nearby to offer protection. Opposition leaders within those species would receive funding and support to create internal pressure for joining. The pattern was consistent across dozens of species, and the documentation was thorough. Blake showed communication intercepts and financial records and testimony from species that had eventually joined under what they believed was duress. The council had never presented membership as truly optional because they had made sure that refusing carried consequences too severe for most species to bear. Several council members began shouting denials, but Blake calmly continued his presentation. He explained that the council was not an alliance of equals, but rather a protection system where membership was coerced through subtle and not-so-subtle pressure. The philosophical justifications about collective security and shared sacrifice were window dressing for what was essentially a galactic empire that had learned to disguise conquest as diplomacy. Thorum called for order and demanded to know where Blake had obtained this classified information. Blake smiled and explained that humanity had been thorough in their research and that several council member species had quietly provided documentation. Because they were tired of the system, but had no way to challenge it alone, the council's intelligence security was less effective than they believed. Then Blake revealed humanity's countermove, and the holographic display showed a map of the galaxy with 17 star systems highlighted in blue. These were the species that had joined the Free Trade Coalition over the past months, and Blake explained that every one of them had signed mutual defense pacts with humanity. If the council attacked human ships, they would be triggering defense agreements with 17 other civilizations. More shocking was Blake's next revelation, and 5 of those 17 species were current council members who had grown disillusioned with the system. They had maintained their membership publicly while secretly aligning with humanity because they wanted change, feared the consequences of open defiance. Now they were prepared to stand with humanity and demand reform. The chamber erupted into chaos, and delegates shouted accusations at each other while trying to identify which members had betrayed the council. Dex demanded immediate military action against all coalition members, but Thorum overruled him and called for calm. The situation had just become infinitely more complicated because the council could not wage war against its own members without destroying the legitimacy they claimed to defend. Blake waited for the noise to subside and then delivered his final blow. The holographic display shifted to show detailed intelligence maps of council space, and humanity had mapped every major military installation and industrial complex and infrastructure hub throughout the council's territory. The precision was disturbing, and several military commanders in the audience recognized that these were not rough estimates, but exact tactical data. Blake explained that if humanity had wanted war, they could have struck first and targeted critical facilities before the Council even knew they were under attack. But humans genuinely preferred peace, and they had gathered this intelligence not as preparation for aggression, but as proof. The message was unmistakable, and humanity had the capability to hurt the Council badly, but was choosing not to use it. He then made his proposal, and the Council would formally recognize human sovereignty and the Free Trade Coalition as an independent entity outside Council authority. In exchange, humanity and the Coalition would establish diplomatic relations with the Council and coordinate on mutual threats like piracy and maintain open communication channels. Not membership, but genuine partnership between sovereign equals. Blake explained that the Coalition species were not trying to destroy the Council, but rather to create an alternative. For those who valued independence over collective security, species that wanted the Council's protection could remain members. Those that preferred autonomy could join the Coalition. The galaxy was large enough for both systems to coexist, President Thorm requested. A recess to allow the Council to deliberate, and Blake was escorted to a waiting area while the Assembly descended into the most contentious debate in its history. The hardliners, led by Vex, argued that accepting Blake's proposal would be the end of Council authority, not that they needed to call his bluff and launch the attack. If some member species had betrayed them, then those species would be dealt with after humanity was contained. But the moderate faction had grown stronger after Blake's presentation and ambassador Velix stood to deliver an impassioned speech. He argued that everything Blake had shown them was true, and that the Council had become exactly what humanity accused them of being. They had built a system where membership was technically voluntary but practically mandatory, and they had justified this through appeals to security and prosperity. While ignoring the cost of freedom, Velix pointed out that the species in Blake's coalition were not enemies of civilization, but rather people who wanted the same things the Council claimed to offer, which were peace and cooperation and mutual benefit. The difference was they wanted these things without surrendering their right to govern themselves. If the Council truly believed in the principles they espoused, then they should be willing to prove it by allowing alternatives to exist. The debate raged for hours, and votes were called and failed, and coalitions formed and collapsed. Economic Minister Zeroth presented calculations showing that war would devastate both sides regardless of who won, and that peaceful coexistence with the Coalition would actually benefit Council members through increased trade opportunities. Several military commanders admitted that fighting a war against an enemy that had already penetrated their security so thoroughly would be extremely costly. Finally, as the station's day cycle turned toward night, a compromise proposal emerged. The Council would recognize the Free Trade Coalition's sovereignty and establish formal diplomatic relations. Both organizations would coordinate on matters of mutual interest and maintain independent operations in their respective territories. Species would be free to choose membership in either organization or remain independent. The vote was close, but it passed with a majority of 62%. Blake was summoned back to the chamber, and President Thorm announced the decision with visible exhaustion. He acknowledged that the Council had lost sight of its founding principles, and that Blake's challenge had forced them to confront uncomfortable truths. The galaxy was changing, and the Council would need to change with it, or become irrelevant. Blake accepted the terms and offered a formal treaty of mutual recognition that his legal team had prepared. The signing ceremony was brief and tense, but when it concluded, humanity and the Free Trade Coalition had achieved what no species had ever accomplished before. They had said no to the Galactic Council and made it stick. As Blake departed Nexus Prime, he reflected on the journey that had brought humanity to this point. They had not sought to destroy the Council or prove themselves superior, but had simply insisted on their right to choose their own path. The cost had been high and the risk had been enormous, but the principle of freedom was worth defending. The days following the agreement saw a flurry of diplomatic activity and 3 additional species applied for coalition membership, while 2 others requested observer status. The Council's leadership began the difficult process of reforming their membership requirements and making them genuinely voluntary. Some hardliners resigned in protest, including War Coordinator Dex, who refused to serve in what he called a weakened organization, Captain. Helen Morris returned to Earth and was immediately sent back out with a new mandate to help establish the Coalition's governing structure. The 17 member species needed to figure out how to coordinate their activities while maintaining their sovereignty. And it was exactly the kind of complex, diplomatic challenge she excelled at on Earth. Admiral Blake met with the planetary leaders and briefed them on everything that had transpired. Humanity had gambled their future on the conviction that freedom mattered more than safety, and the gamble had paid off. But Blake warned against complacency because the Coalition was new and fragile, and maintaining it would require constant effort and good faith from all members. The galaxy settled into an uneasy new equilibrium, where 2 different visions of interstellar civilization existed side by side. The Council continued to offer security through collective action, while the Coalition offered freedom through voluntary cooperation. Time would tell which system would prove more successful, but for the first time in 2,000 years, species had a genuine choice. Ambassador Velix requested a transfer to the new Council diplomatic mission to the Coalition, and he wanted to help build bridges between the 2 organizations. His request was approved, and he arrived at the Coalition's temporary headquarters with hope that perhaps both sides could learn from each other. The stars continued their eternal dance, and humanity had earned their place among them, not through submission, but through the courage to stand for what they believed was right, and the galaxy would never be quite the same.